Empty your pockets, all of it, on the counter, right now." The words landed like a flat hand on glass, sharp, final, calibrated to carry. The man behind the counter at Hargrove's Fine Jewelry and Pawn, a heavy-set figure, in a short-sleeved dress shirt with a laminated name tag that read Dale in block letters, had not lowered his voice. He had not even tried. The shop sat on the corner of Meridian Avenue in downtown Crestfield, Ohio, and on a Saturday afternoon in late October it held perhaps 14 people. Browsers, sellers, a couple near the back examining estate rings, 2 teenagers by the guitar wall, a woman in a yellow coat who had come in to pick up a layaway. Every one of them had gone still. The display cases hummed their low electrical note beneath the silence. The smell of metal polish and old wood hung in the air, the particular scent of a place where other people's histories changed hands for cash. The man Dale was addressing stood at the counter with both hands visible, relaxed at his sides. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 50s, wearing a clean gray Henley and dark slacks. His name was Calvin Jerome Okafor. He had set a single item on the glass counter. A watch, not a flashy watch. A plain, heavy timepiece on a worn leather strap, the kind of watch that had been somewhere and done something. He had asked, politely, what it might be worth if he were to sell it. That was all he had done. "I said, empty your pockets," Dale said again, louder, "or I'm calling the police right now." A woman near the engagement rings took a half-step back. One of the teenagers reached for his phone. The woman in the yellow coat looked at the floor and kept her eyes there. Nobody moved toward Calvin. Nobody said a word on his behalf. The couple near the estate rings had stopped pretending to look at the rings. They were watching the counter the way people watch an accident, with the particular stillness of those who have decided, in the first second, that this is not their moment to move. Calvin did not raise his hands in the performative way that sometimes becomes a reflex. He simply stood there, both palms still visible, and waited with a stillness that was not submission. It was something else entirely, something built over a long time, in hard places by a man who had learned that composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the mastery of it. Dale had already reached for the phone. What Dale Hargrove did not know, what nobody in that shop knew except the man standing quietly on the other side of the glass, was who Calvin Jerome Okafor actually was, and what that watch actually meant. And when the truth came out, it did not just embarrass Dale Hargrove, it cost him the shop. Stay with this one. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Calvin Okafor really was, and how a man can carry 30 years of extraordinary worth in plain sight and still be invisible to people who have already decided what they see. He had grown up in a 2-bedroom house on Dunbar Street in the East Crestfield neighborhood that the city's development map still labeled transitional, a word that meant the houses were real and the people were real, but the investment never quite arrived. His mother, Adeline Okafor, had worked the overnight shift at Mercy General for 19 years as a certified nursing assistant, coming home each morning smelling of antiseptic and effort, and she made breakfast before she slept, because that was the kind of woman she was. She moved through the kitchen in the gray early light with the deliberateness Calvin had watched every day of his childhood, cracking eggs with one hand, setting the table with the other, never once suggesting that the world owed her a different arrangement, not bitterness, not grievance, discipline. The understanding that the work itself was the argument, and that it had to be done whether anyone was watching or not. His grandfather, James Okafor, had said it plainly. Calvin was 11 years old, sitting on the back porch on a July evening, and James had been shelling butter beans into a metal bowl, the dry snap of each pod the only sound in the yard. And without looking up, he had said, "Stay low, build high, let the work speak when you're gone from the room." Calvin had written it on the inside cover of every notebook he owned from that day forward. He had never stopped. He was not a loud man. He moved through rooms without announcing himself, paid his bills without ceremony, kept his lawn trimmed and his word without exception. The neighbors on his block knew him as the man who shoveled their walks without being asked, who left no note and required no thanks. The veterans at the American Legion post on Elm knew him as the man who showed up every third Saturday for the food pantry, who carried boxes and stayed until the last family had been served. He did not post about it. He simply did it and went home, and the next month he came back. What he had done between the ages of 22 and 51 was something he discussed with almost no one. He had enlisted in the United States Army in the spring of 1989, 2 weeks after his community college graduation, because he wanted to serve and because James Okafor had served in Korea, and Calvin understood, in the way that certain things pass between generations without being spoken, that service was a form of continuity. He had gone in as a private. He had come out 30 years later as a retired master sergeant with a record his commanding officers had described, in writing, as a career defined by uncommon valor under sustained conditions of extreme danger. The unofficial language, from the men and women who had served beside him in 3 deployments across 2 theaters of war, was simpler. They said Calvin Okafor was the reason some of them were still alive. He did not talk about that either. The watch on the counter at Hargrove's had belonged to his grandfather, James. It was a Hamilton military-issue field watch, 1951 production, the kind issued to American servicemen during the Korean War. Calvin had carried it through 3 deployments in a chest pocket, not on his wrist because he did not want to risk the glass. He had brought it in to Hargrove's that Saturday, not because he needed money, he did not, but because a friend had mentioned the shop's owner had expertise in military timepieces, and Calvin had been curious about its provenance, its catalog number, whether it might be worth preserving more formally. He had driven the 12 minutes from Dunbar Street with the watch wrapped in a cloth in his jacket pocket, thinking about James, thinking about the bowl of butter beans, thinking about nothing in particular. He had not expected to be accused of stealing it before he finished his first sentence. Now, let me tell you about Dale Hargrove, and the particular kind of certainty that lives in a man who has never once been wrong about anything, because he has never once allowed himself to be. Dale Hargrove had inherited the shop from his father, Bud Hargrove, who had opened it in 1974 with a loan and a handshake and a genuine talent for appraising estate jewelry. Bud had been a fair man by most accounts. Dale was a different proposition. Dale had grown up behind that counter watching his father treat every customer with the same attention regardless of what they looked like, and somewhere along the way Dale had decided that was inefficient. That there were customers worth your time and customers who were going to waste it, and that a man with 30 years of experience could tell the difference at the door. Dale was 53 years old. He owned the building outright, a fact he mentioned regularly. He was a member of the Crestfield Business Owners Association, a past president of the Meridian Avenue Merchants Guild, and a man who had called the police on 6 occasions in the last 4 years for incidents that responding officers had, in 5 of those 6 cases, logged as no crime observed. He kept a printed copy of his concealed carry permit taped inside the cabinet beneath the register. He had never needed it, but he kept it there. And that knowledge was part of the texture of how he stood behind his counter, with the particular ease of a man who believes the room belongs to him. He had looked at Calvin Okafor when Calvin walked through the door and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. The door had barely closed before Dale's posture changed. A slight forward lean, a narrowing of attention that was not curiosity but its opposite. When Calvin had said calmly, "I was told you might know something about Hamilton military-issue field watches. I have one here I'd like to ask about," Dale had not heard the question. He had heard something else, something that had no basis in anything Calvin had said or done, but that had been sitting in Dale's chest for years, waiting for a shape to attach itself to. He had said, "Where did you get that?" Not as a question, as an accusation. Calvin had answered evenly. He said it had been his grandfather's. He said his grandfather had served in Korea. Dale had looked at the watch, then at Calvin, and something had shifted behind his eyes. Not doubt, not reconsideration, but a doubling down, the way a man who is committed to a wrong turn drives faster instead of stopping. He said, "I'm going to need to verify that." And then he said, "Empty your pockets, all of it, on the counter, right now." And now the shop was silent, and Dale's hand was on the phone, and Calvin Jerome Okafor was standing with both hands visible, saying nothing, waiting. The woman in the yellow coat, whose name was Renata Sims, was a paralegal at a firm 3 blocks down Meridian. She had been coming to Hargroves for 2 years to make layaway payments on a pearl bracelet for her mother's birthday, and the woman behind the layaway counter knew her name and always had the receipt ready. She was standing 6 feet from Calvin when Dale made his demand, and she watched the whole thing with the careful attention of someone trained to notice what the record contains and what it does not. She felt the particular sick weight of a moment where you know something is wrong, and you have to decide whether knowing is enough or whether knowing requires something more. She looked at the other people in the shop, their studied stillness, their careful looking away, the couple near the estate rings who had found something fascinating to examine on the floor. She looked back at Calvin. She did not look away. She took out her own phone. Quietly, she pressed record, and she held it at her side with the screen dark, and she did not move. Dale Hargrove had already dialed. The call connected in under a minute. 2 officers arrived in 4. The first through the door was Officer Darnell Webb, 29 years old, 18 months on the force, a compact man with careful eyes who had grown up 3 miles from Dunbar Street and who had learned in those 18 months to read a room before he read a report. He stepped inside, took in the scene. The man at the counter, hands visible, composed. The shop owner behind the glass, certain and slightly flushed, and he did not reach for anything. He let the room settle for a half second. Then he asked, in a level voice, what the situation was. Dale told him there was a man attempting to sell stolen property. He pointed at the watch. Officer Webb looked at Calvin. Calvin met his eyes without urgency, without the particular brightness of a man trying to perform innocence. He said, quietly, "It was my grandfather's. I can tell you exactly what it is if you'd like." Webb said, "Go ahead." Calvin said, "It's a Hamilton Model 992B military-issue field watch, manufactured in 1951, serial number 2C447801. It was issued to my grandfather, James Okafor, United States Army, during his deployment to Korea in 1952. He carried it at Heartbreak Ridge. He brought it home. He gave it to me in 1994, 2 years before he died. The shop was very quiet. Dale said, "That doesn't prove anything. Anyone can memorize a serial number." Officer Webb had not moved. He was looking at the watch on the glass counter, at the worn leather strap and the small scratches on the case back that spoke of decades and distance. Then he was looking at Calvin. Then he said, carefully, "Sir, do you have any documentation with you?" Calvin reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, slowly, deliberately, with the measured economy of a man who has done this before and knows precisely what the movement looks like to someone watching. And he produced a folded document. It was a copy of his grandfather's military discharge papers, DD Form 214, which Calvin had carried in his wallet for 11 years, not because he expected to need it, but because James had asked him to keep it close. He unfolded it along the same worn creases and set it on the counter beside the watch. Webb looked at it. He looked at the serial number on the watch. He looked at the name on the form. Then he looked at something else. Something on Calvin's jacket that Dale Hargrove had not noticed, because Dale had stopped looking at Calvin the moment Calvin walked through the door. On the left breast of Calvin's gray Henley, almost invisible against the fabric, was a small pin, a pale blue rectangle, 5 white stars. Webb had seen that pin before. He had seen it in a photograph on the wall of the American Legion post on Elm Street, above a caption he had read once and remembered, "The way you remember things that carry weight." He knew what it was. He said nothing yet. But his posture changed. Slightly, measurably. The careful, professional stillness of a man who has just understood that the room he is standing in is larger than it appeared. And Dale Hargrove, who had been watching Webb with the satisfied expression of a man whose call has been answered and whose authority has been confirmed, began, for the first time, to look uncertain. Something in Webb's silence was not the silence he had expected. It had a different texture. He could not name it, but he felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before the weather turns. It was not over, not even close. In fact, it was about to become something Dale Hargrove would spend the next 2 years trying to recover from. Not with anger, not with anything dramatic, just with the slow, institutional weight of what happens when a man of Calvin Okafor's standing decides, quietly and without rancor, that the record should be corrected. But we are not there yet. Dead silence. That was what filled Hargrove's fine jewelry and pawn after Officer Darnell Webb looked at the pin on Calvin Okafor's chest and looked at the discharge papers and looked at the serial number on the Hamilton field watch, and then looked at Dale Hargrove with an expression that was not accusation, not theater, but something quieter and more final. The display cases went on humming. The October light came through the front windows at a low angle and lay across the glass counter in long, pale bars. Nobody moved. Webb said, "Mr. Hargrove, I need you to step back from the counter." Not a suggestion. Dale blinked. "Excuse me? Step back, please." Dale stepped back. He did it the way a man steps back when he is trying to decide whether he is being moved or whether he is choosing to move, and has not yet worked out which it is. Webb turned to Calvin. He said, "Sir, I apologize for the delay. Can I ask, is that a Medal of Honor pin?" Calvin looked at Officer Webb for a long moment. The shop was so quiet that the hum of the display case lighting was the loudest thing in it. A low electrical drone beneath the stillness, beneath the held breath of 14 people who had stopped pretending to be anywhere else. He said, "Yes." One word. Webb straightened. Not dramatically, not with any performance in it, just the small, involuntary correction of a man who has suddenly understood the full weight of the room he is standing in. Dale Hargrove heard the word and did not understand it. His jaw moved slightly as though he were about to speak, and then he stopped because something in Webb's posture told him for the first time that speaking might be the wrong choice. Calvin reached back into his jacket pocket and produced a second folded document, smaller than the first. It was a letter, official letterhead, the seal of the United States Army at the top. Below it, a citation. Below the citation, a signature. And at the top, in plain block letters, the words that Dale Hargrove now leaned forward to read because he could not help himself, because the room had shifted in a way he could not name and he needed to understand why. He read them. He did not speak for a very long time. What those documents confirmed was what the pin on Calvin's chest had already announced to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Calvin Jerome Okafor had been awarded the Medal of Honor in 2003 for actions during a combat engagement in Afghanistan in which he had, under direct enemy fire and with no cover, carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety, then returned a third time to suppress the ambush that had pinned his unit, alone, for 11 minutes until reinforcements arrived. 3 of the men in that unit had not survived. 7 had. Calvin's commanding officer had written, in the official recommendation, that without the actions of Master Sergeant Okafor, the casualty count would have been reversed. Calvin had never mentioned it to the neighbors who watched him shovel their walks. He wore the pin because James Okafor had told him, on the back porch on a July evening while the butter beans snapped into the metal bowl, that a man should carry his history without broadcasting it, and Calvin had interpreted that to mean the pin was enough. A small acknowledgement. A private continuity. Not a declaration. He had not walked into Hargrove's Pond to declare anything. He had walked in to ask about a watch. Renata Sims had been recording for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. She had not moved from her position near the layaway counter. She had stood with her phone at her side, the screen dark but the camera running, and she had captured Dale's demand, and Calvin's stillness, and the arrival of Officer Webb, and the moment Webb asked about the pin, and Calvin's single-word answer, and the sound of the shop going quiet in a way that was different from the quiet that had come before. The first quiet had been the quiet of a crowd that had decided not to see. The second quiet was the quiet of a crowd that had seen something it could not unsee. She kept recording. Dale Hargrove had not moved from behind the counter. His hand was no longer on the phone. He was looking at the citation, and his face had done something complicated. Not shame, not yet, but the preliminary work of a man whose certainty has just discovered it was standing on nothing. The color had gone out of his cheeks. His shoulders had dropped a half-inch. He looked, for the first time since Calvin had walked through the door, like a man who was not sure what came next. He said, finally, "I didn't," and then he stopped. Webb said, "Mr. Hargrove." Dale looked at him. Webb said, "I'm going to ask you to think carefully about what you say next." 5 words of caution, delivered without heat, without satisfaction, without any of the theater that the moment might have invited. Webb was not interested in theater. He was a man who had grown up 3 miles from Dunbar Street and who had spent 18 months learning that the job was about what was true and what the record showed, and what a person deserved when they were standing in a room where nobody else had chosen to stand with them. He turned back to Calvin. He said, "Master Sergeant Okafor, I apologize on behalf of this department for the circumstances that required our presence here today." 4 people in the shop heard the rank and understood immediately what it meant. The rest understood it a moment later, the way understanding moves through a crowd, not all at once, but in a wave, person to person, the information changing the shape of what they thought they had been watching. The teenager who had reached for his phone lowered it. The couple near the estate rings looked at each other. The woman in the yellow coat finally lifted her eyes from the floor. Renata Sims lowered her phone. She pressed stop. She looked at Calvin, and Calvin looked at her, and something passed between them that required no words. The acknowledgement of 2 people who had both been in a room where the right thing was not being done, and who had each, in their own way, decided that was not acceptable. Calvin said, "Thank you, officer." He picked up the watch. He picked up the discharge papers and the citation. He folded them carefully, along the same creases, with the same economy of motion he had used to unfold them. He put them back in his pocket. He did not look at Dale Hargrove, not out of contempt. Out of the particular discipline of a man who has already decided that some rooms are not worth the energy it takes to fill them. Then he said, to no one in particular, in a voice that was not loud and was not soft, "I think I'll find another shop." He walked to the door. He opened it. The October air came in, cold and carrying the smell of dry leaves and distant rain, and Calvin Jerome Okafor walked out into it without looking back. The door closed behind him. Dead silence. And then Renata Sims walked to the counter, set her layaway receipt down in front of Dale Hargrove, and said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "I'd like a refund, please. I'll be taking my business elsewhere." Dale Hargrove did not argue. He opened the register. His hands were not entirely steady. He had not yet understood what was coming, but something in him had registered, in the way that certain truths register before the mind has finished processing them, that the afternoon had just become the worst afternoon of his professional life. He was right. The recording went up on a Sunday. Renata Sims had not set out to make it viral. She had set out to make it documented. She posted it to her personal account with a caption that was 11 words long. "This happened yesterday at Hargrove's Pawn on Meridian. He has a Medal of Honor." She tagged the Crestfield Courier, the local NBC affiliate, and the Ohio Veterans Advocacy Coalition, because she was a paralegal and she understood that the difference between a complaint and a consequence was often simply a matter of who received the information. By Sunday evening, the clip had been viewed 40,000 times. By Monday morning, it was 240,000. The caption did not editorialize. It did not need to. The video was 4 minutes and 22 seconds of a man standing with his hands visible while another man demanded he empty his pockets, and then it was the sound of a shop going quiet when the truth arrived, and then it was a retired master sergeant and Medal of Honor recipient walking out of a pawn shop in Ohio because he had been treated as a suspect for asking a question about a watch that had belonged to his grandfather. The Crestfield Courier ran it Monday morning. The NBC affiliate ran it at noon. By Monday afternoon, the Associated Press had picked it up, 3 veterans advocacy organizations had issued statements, and the phone at Hargrove's Fine Jewelry and Pawn had been ringing without pause for 6 hours. Dale Hargrove did not answer the phone. His wife answered it twice, then stopped. His son deleted the shop's social media accounts by noon. It was too late. The shop held 3 active contracts with municipal and county agencies. a property storage agreement with the Crestfield Police Department, an appraisal services contract with the county probate court, and a vendor agreement with the city's Historic Preservation Office. Together, they represented approximately 31% of the shop's annual revenue, renewed without review for 11 years because nobody had ever had a reason to look at them closely. By Tuesday morning, they had a reason. The city manager's office placed the property storage agreement under administrative review at 10 a.m. The county probate court followed at noon. The Historic Preservation Office followed at 2. None of them used the word terminated. They used the word review. But, in the language of municipal contracts, review and termination were often the same word with different timelines. The Ohio Veterans Advocacy Coalition filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission on Tuesday afternoon. It was not a lawsuit. Not yet. But it was the kind of complaint that, once filed, has a life of its own. Calvin Okafor had not filed it. He had not asked anyone to file it. When contacted by the coalition on Monday evening, he said simply that he appreciated the support and that he trusted the process. Measured, without heat, without any indication that he was watching the walls come down around Dale Hargrove, because he was not watching. He had a food pantry shift on Saturday and a lawn to finish before the frost, and a Hamilton field watch that still needed a proper appraisal from someone who knew what they were looking at. He did not post about any of it. He never did. The Crestfield Courier ran a follow-up piece on Wednesday. A reporter named Cassandra Yee, 26 years old, 3 years at the paper, had pulled the police call logs and found the 6 calls Hargrove had made in 4 years, and the 5 logged as no crime observed, and the demographic pattern that emerged when you laid those calls side by side. She had also found a civil complaint from 2019, filed and later withdrawn, from a man named Marcus Trent, who had brought in a saxophone to sell and had been detained for 40 minutes while Dale waited for police to verify it was not stolen. It was not stolen. Marcus Trent had not pursued the complaint because he could not afford the time. Cassandra Yee found him working at a music school on the east side of Crestfield, and he agreed to be quoted. He said, simply, that he had always wondered if it would happen to someone else. It had. Cassandra Yee called Dale Hargrove for comment. He declined. She called the Crestfield Business Owners Association. Their president said the organization did not comment on the personal conduct of members. She noted in the article that Dale Hargrove had been a member for 17 years. By Wednesday afternoon, the Business Owners Association had issued a second statement. This one said that Dale Hargrove had voluntarily resigned his membership effective immediately. He had not resigned voluntarily, but that was the language they used. Officer Darnell Webb was not disciplined. His supervisor reviewed the body camera footage and issued a written commendation for professional conduct. Webb filed it in his personnel folder and did not mention it to anyone except his mother, who had grown up 4 blocks from Dunbar Street and who cried when he told her, which he had not expected. He called her back that evening, and they talked for an hour. Renata Sims received a handwritten note in the mail 10 days after the incident. It was on plain paper in a careful, unhurried hand. It said, "Thank you for not looking away. That took something. My grandfather would have called it character. C.J. Okafor." She framed it. She kept it on the wall of her office next to her paralegal certification, where she could see it every morning when she sat down at her desk. The municipal contracts were not renewed. All 3. The formal notices arrived in December. The Civil Rights Commission complaint resolved in February with a finding of probable cause and a conciliation agreement requiring documented anti-discrimination protocols, 2 years of compliance monitoring, and a civil penalty that the Courier reported, citing sources, was significant. Dale Hargrove tried to hold on. He came in every morning and stood behind the counter and waited for the foot traffic to return. It did not return, not in the way it had been. The name Hargrove's Fine Jewelry and Pawn now returned as its first search result, a news article with a 4-minute and 22-second video embedded at the top. He listed the building in March. It sold in June. Not with anger, not with revenge, with the slow, institutional weight of what happens when the record is clear and the documentation is real, and the person who was wronged is the kind of person who keeps every piece of paper in order. The sign came down in July. By August, the windows on Meridian Avenue were papered over, and the name Hargroves was gone from the glass. Not with a verdict read aloud in a courtroom, not with a confrontation at a door. Just a sold sign, and then no sign, and then paper on the windows, where the jewelry cases used to be. The building sold for less than Dale Hargrove had paid to renovate it in 2018. The appraisal reputation that Bud Hargrove had spent 30 years building had been replaced in the public record by a 4-minute and 22-second video and the articles that followed it. Dale moved to a suburb outside Columbus. He did not open another shop. He took a position at an auction house appraising estate lots, a job that kept him away from counters and customers and the particular kind of authority he had exercised for 20 years behind a pane of glass. In the 18 months after the incident, not a single professional organization in the Ohio jewelry and appraisal trade invited Dale Hargrove to speak, to serve, or to represent them. The Meridian Avenue Merchants Guild elected a new president. They did not mention his name at the installation. Certainty is expensive when it is wrong. Not that he was cruel, though he was. Not that he was biased, though he was. But that he had mistaken the feeling of certainty for the fact of knowledge, and he had done it in front of 14 people, and one of them had been recording. Renata Sims said yes to the Ohio Veterans Advocacy Coalition's invitation to speak at their annual recognition dinner in November. She said no to everything else: the news organizations, the civil rights attorneys, the documentary filmmaker. She was a paralegal, not a spokesperson. She had done what she had done because it was the right thing to do, and she did not need a camera to confirm that. What she did not expect was the letter from the managing partner at her firm, which arrived on her desk on a Thursday 2 weeks after the video went up. It was not a reprimand. It was a promotion. The letter cited her professional judgment, her composure under pressure, and her understanding of documentation and evidence. It offered her a position as senior paralegal with a caseload focused on civil rights and employment law, effective the 1st of December. The managing partner had written in the final paragraph that character was not a thing you could train into a person. Renata Sims accepted. She started in December. She kept the framed note on the wall. Officer Darnell Webb received his written commendation in November and filed it without ceremony. He continued to read rooms before he read reports. He visited the American Legion post on Elm Street the following spring and stood in front of the photograph on the wall, the one with the caption he had read once and remembered. He stood there for a long moment. Then he went home and called his mother, and Calvin Jerome Okafor went back to his life on Dunbar Street. He finished the lawn before the frost. He worked the food pantry on the third Saturday of every month. He shoveled his neighbors' walks when it snowed before they were awake, so that when they opened their doors in the morning, the walk was clear, and the man who had cleared it was already gone. He found a watchmaker in Columbus, a retired man named Everett Stills, who had been repairing military timepieces for 40 years, who looked at the Hamilton field watch for 3 full minutes without speaking, turning it in the light, reading the case back with his thumbnail, and then looked at Calvin and said, quietly, "Where has this been?" Calvin told him. All of it. Korea, Heartbreak Ridge, 3 deployments in a chest pocket. Everett Stills cleaned the movement, replaced the crown, polished the crystal until it was clear as water, and refused payment. He said it was an honor. Calvin thanked him and meant it, and wore the watch home on his wrist for the first time, because the crystal was new and the risk was manageable now, and because James Okafor had carried it at Heartbreak Ridge, and it seemed right, finally, to let it see the light. He sat on his back porch that evening. The air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that carries sound further than it should, and he could hear, faintly, the traffic in the main road 3 blocks over, and somewhere a dog, and the particular silence of a neighborhood that has settled into itself for the night. He looked at the watch on his wrist. The restored crystal caught the porch light and held it for a moment, and Calvin thought about James, shelling butter beans into a metal bowl on a July evening, not looking up, saying the thing that had become the architecture of a life. Stay low, build high. He had done that. He had done it for 58 years, and the world had not always noticed, and sometimes the world had done worse than not notice, and he had kept building anyway because the work was the argument, and the argument did not require an audience. He went inside. He made dinner. He washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. That is the whole of it. Not a triumph with a trumpet. Not a reckoning with a speech. Just a man going home to his life, which was a good life, which had always been a good life, which had never required anyone else's recognition to be what it was. And that is the part I want you to sit with. Because Calvin Okafor is not a singular story. He is a common one. There are people in every city, in every room, in every shop, on every corner of this country who carry extraordinary worth in plain sight and are met daily with the assumptions of people who stopped looking before they started seeing. Retired soldiers and teachers and nurses and engineers. People who have done remarkable things and come home and lived quietly and asked nothing of anyone except to be treated as what they are. Human beings deserving of basic dignity. And every day, in some shop on some corner, someone decides in 4 seconds what they see and acts on it. And the crowd goes still. The question is not whether it happens. It happens every day. The question is what we do in the 4 seconds before the crowd goes still. Whether we reach for our phone, whether we speak, whether we are the person who looks away or the person who does not. Renata Sims did not look away. Darnell Webb read the room before he read the report. And Calvin Okafor stood with his hands visible and his patience intact, and let the truth do what the truth does when it is given enough room to breathe. He did not need to be angry. He had never needed to be angry. The record was always there. The work was always there. The watch was always there, in his pocket, carrying 30 years of history that no one had bothered to ask about. They should have asked. Now, here's the question I want to leave with you. If Calvin had walked into that shop without the pin, without the citation, without the discharge papers, If he had been exactly who he was, but without the documents to prove it, would the outcome have been different? Drop a comment. I want to hear what you think, because I think the answer to that question says something important about where we actually are. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the people the world overlooked, the ones who built in silence and stood in rooms where no one stood with them, subscribe. We find those people every week. We think they deserve to be seen.